Hello and welcome to the world-famous and award-winning Driving You Crazy podcast. This is the show where we talk about all things transportation, anything that gets you from here to there. I'm the traffic anchor and the transportation reporter for Denver 7 News, Jason Luber. If you would like to contact me, all my contact information is in the description of this fine program, and that's where you can send me a note and you can rate it and review it or whatever, I don't know, on your favorite listening app. Here's the question some think could be contentious. Should city street parking be free? And in areas where there are meters, how much is too much to park for an hour? Big and small cities alike wrestle with these issues. And what brings me here is that I saw on my LinkedIn page a piece titled Prime Real Estate, Rock Bottom Price, The Politics of Parking, written by my guest, John Conway. John's the co-founder and the Chief Business Development Officer at Parking Revenue Recovery Services, Inc. He's also a former City of Denver parking commissioner, longtime parking operations veteran, and, of course, a host of his own podcast called All Things Parking with Danny and John. John, thanks so much for being here on the world-famous Driving You Crazy podcast.
Thank you, Jason, for having me.
All right, so did you always dream of being in the parking business? Not many kids grow up going, I want to be a parking guy.
I did not. It was certainly not in the cards. I think most people in parking kind of stumble into it. And then if you're there long enough, you kind of don't get out. So most people would say we kind of fell into it. But I've been in it for 30 plus years and I love it. And parking's been good to me. So
what exactly is Parking Revenue Recovery Services?
So PRRS has been around for 23 plus years. It started out originally as kind of a niche business that collected delinquent parking tickets. So back in the day when there was meter boxes and people were stuffing their money into those yellow boxes, parking companies around the country would kind of leave these little orange envelopes or yellow envelopes and people that didn't pay. So parking revenue recovery originally focused on collecting those delinquent envelopes that people didn't pay. And then over the 23 years, it evolved into more of providing the labor for both municipal, universities, private, actually providing the boots on the ground and enforcement and specifically focused on just the enforcement and collections of delinquent or scofflaws as they're referred to.
So you don't set the parking rates for these lots. You just help enforce when somebody doesn't pay whatever the rate is.
That's right. And then over the last 5 years, we've evolved even further into technology. Which is kind of where we are today with the Vision AI technology, where it's similar to toll roads. We identify the vehicle coming in and leaving, which is a parking session, and then that parking session is either compliant or non-compliant, and then there's notices that are sent through the mail. So that's the evolution right now, and excitingly, the technology has been proven over the last 3 or 4 years to be kind of the gold standard. And so we've created not PRRS, but there's a need for the technology outside of PRRS. And so there's a brand, we're introducing Paraline as a new company that people can buy the technology and not necessarily want a compliance program. So the technology goes way beyond, compliance and enforcement. It creates parking sessions, gives you insight into what's going on in your parking lot 24/7. Every space tells a story. Yeah. And we're also doing auto start and stop, which starts a transaction and ends a transaction through the interaction with payment apps like Spot Hero, Park Mobile. And hopefully the goal of Paraline is to increase front-end compliance and not have to send out notices. So the easier you can make the transaction for customers, so it's seamless. They'll drive in, they'll get a text message once we recognize the license plate, it'll say you're parked at lot X and your time has started. And then when they leave, they get a receipt. So it's kind of the technology starting to interact with the vehicle itself, which is the piece that a smart city needs.
What is interesting when you were talking about the AI technology, it made me think right to photo radar. But with photo radar, that is on a public street with a government agency accusing you of doing something wrong, speeding, or going over the speed limit. But in your case, you're on a private parking lot and you're using that technology to then send out the notice. Because if I get one of the notices from the photo radar ticket, I don't have to pay it. They have to come and serve me physically and say because it technically is a summons to court. Yeah, because when the officer comes, they're an officer of the court. They're giving you a ticket. It's actually a summons to go to court. You can just do a plea bargain where you're paying down. You're paying a fine. You're pleading guilty, and you're taking a lesser fine. And lesser penalties, or you could have the chance to go to court. But in your case, it sounds like that it's just you pay it, and that's the way you pay. I mean, that's the way it is. You're basically guilty by coming onto my land and doing something that you paying for, basically stealing our time on our parking lot.
Kind of. So It's important to mention that private property. So what we do is we're not issuing a fine, or we're not issuing a citation. We're issuing a notice of noncompliance, which means on the rules, when you pull onto the private property, there's signs, and that when you're entering that private property, there's permittable uses to the private property. And so one of those permittable uses is registering. So you have to register while you're on that private property. So basically, what we're doing is our notices are for non-registration. So you're not compliant with the rules of the property. So they're not like a fine. We don't set the parking rates. We don't set anything to do with the rates of the parking. It's just you're either there and you're compliant with the registration process, or you're not. So it's kind of a private property, rules that they establish on each of the lots, and all of them are a little bit different. There's retail centers, of course. We do work for municipalities, so there's all different scenarios in what we do.
Yeah.
So
then, do you set the fine? If you don't set the parking rates, do you set the fines? Is that something that you guys do, or is it the parking lot?
We set the notice amount, absolutely, and sometimes. People that see the notice amounts, they want to compare them to a municipality, and a municipality is different. They have a different fee structure. So initially, it might be a low dollar amount, like $35. And then after a length of time, it will escalate, and it will continue to escalate. The private sector can't do that just because of litigation in the past. There's court rulings that established that it's called fee stacking. And so the courts ruled that fee stacking was predatory. So of course, so you can't you can't add fees after the fact on private property. So that's a big differentiator from municipal and private property.
Yeah. And then what happens if somebody doesn't pay that fine? Is that has to be then a civil matter and not a criminal matter, right?
It's a civil matter, absolutely. And so, there's an appeals process as well. So, there's incidences out there where technology is not always 100%. You're dealing with several different technologies through API integrations. Of course, we're not the payment provider, so you have multiple different payment providers sending information. So there is a fair appeals process, and the person has the ability to appeal. And there's also an arbitration process where somebody can get an outside party. So if they don't like what the company has decided during that process, there's a process where they can utilize a third party.
Yeah, but it brings me, and I'm thinking just again, I know we're going to get to your article here in a second, but when it goes back to my photo radar theory or thinking, is that when I'm a driver of a car that then gets pulled over by an officer and they are there and they can see me, I'm the one driving, I'm the one handing them the driver's license. But if in a photo radar, they don't know that I'm necessarily the one driving because they have to take the picture and hopefully the picture matches the driver, but it might not be. It might be somebody who is not the owner of the vehicle because the vehicle owner then gets those notices in the photo radar thing. But isn't that the same for your technology? It's the vehicle registration. It's the vehicle that you said you're taking pictures of the license plate in the vehicle, but it might not have been that owner that was using that vehicle to park.
So that's a great point, Jason. And this goes back to my days early on when I was actually walking the parking lots and issuing notices manually. You would have people that would grab you and say, "Hey, you ticketed me because I'm, this," and it's like we ticket automobile. We don't ticket. We notice automobiles, right? So you're not really noticing people. It's the vehicle itself and the registration. So if the vehicle's there, so there are cases where, a son or a daughter or a grandchild was driving, father or grandfather's car. It's the vehicle itself that was in violation or non-compliance of that particular lot.
Yeah. But in photo radar stuff, they have to, if you prove that it's not you, then that goes away. I mean, there's no burden of proof on the person who was driving. It's a burden of proof on the government. So is that different in this civil matter then?
I think it's a little different because, obviously if you're getting a photo radar ticket, there's implications on your driver's license. And so obviously if it's not you, but if your registered vehicle is parked on a lot, it's still utilizing that service. And I think most people today, when we talk about parking, they hate paying for parking. Parking is one of those things that people just don't like to do, and they think it's a rite of passage. But if you look at who owns these lots, they're developers, they're landowners, commercial landowners, and they contribute to downtowns. For the tax base, so if there's not a building there, this is their primary business, right? So they're paying into the ecosystem of the city through property tax, and so most of the time, this revenue is their only source of revenue on that property.
Yeah, I just think that's interesting. My guest is John Conway. He's a co-founder and chief business development officer at Parking Revenue Recovery Services. You can also listen to his podcast called All Things Parking with Danny and John. You can find him at DannyJohnShow.com. Now to the piece that you wrote that I saw on LinkedIn, you said at the beginning of your piece that one of the most valuable public assets, the curb, is routinely undervalued, underpriced, and misused. Let's start with the first point as we go through those three. Undervalued. What should be the curb? What should the curb be worth? And I would think that number would be different from block to block.
Absolutely. I think the reason why I wrote the piece is obviously, I haven't been just doing compliance for my 30 plus years. So a lot of my career was spent in operations. And so on-street parking has always been a challenge for both cities, politicians, and businesses, right? So it's a very challenging. So I was involved in the conversion of Manitou Springs when we converted the free parking to paid parking. And so it was very challenging because the businesses, there's all types of businesses. So the businesses view free parking as a lifeline to their business. But really, when you start looking at the curb, it's the most valuable space. It's the prime real estate right in front of that business. So most of the time when I come across some of these desirable places like Manitou Springs, they can be small or big cities, with no parking program and no paid parking program, and even timed parking, it's chaos. And it's actually the reverse for business. It kills business because most of the time, what winds up in those spaces are the people that aren't really patronizing their business. And so on-street is a prime real estate spot in front of a business, and turnover is healthy. And so a paid parking program is a necessity and a lifeline, but most people don't look at that. So you have a couple factors, right? So you've got politicians that have to answer to their constituents, which is the people, but they also are listening to the businesses as well. So it's very challenging in a city environment politically to price the curb probably the way it should, right? So. And over the years, you've seen the the difference between off-street parking and on-street parking, and the numbers are different. So most of the time, frustration builds because when you pull into a Cherry Creek North or somewhere, there's no. I was on the board of Cherry Creek North for a lot of years, and one of the challenging things that we tried to overcome was the perception that Cherry Creek North was chaotic. There was nowhere to park. But really, there was so much inventory under the ground or above the ground in garages, and so it was very difficult to break that perception that there was actually a lot of parking in Cherry Creek North. It's just there was no metered parking, and so the metered parking was probably underpriced and undervalued, which caused that perception for years that there's I don't want to go to Cherry Creek North because I'm going to park 20 blocks away from where I want to go.
Yeah, and you touched on that just a second ago. And for those listening, Manitou Springs is this little tourist town outside of Colorado Springs, and it's a beautiful little town, little main street, all kinds of fun little shops. You can actually walk around and get. I don't know if you've tried this, John, but you bring a cup, and then you go to the different springs, the real springs and then you taste the water.
Right.
Wow. Have you done that?
I mean, I haven't done that, but I know they have the famous incline there.
Oh yeah, they have that too.
They have that too, and that's a big attraction, which also had parking challenges because there wasn't enough parking. So, like I said, Manitou came to a crossroads years ago. They realized they had they had a great town. It's still a great town. It's a desirable place for people to go for the day, but it was frustrating for people because there was nowhere to park. Yeah. So. And most of the people that were taking those spaces were employees who sat there all day long, right? So, they instituted the paid parking program, which didn't go over well for a long period of time. So, but ultimately, it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, and the next part of your piece, when you said it was routinely undervalued, underpriced, and misused, is underpriced. Again. What do you think those prices should be for that curb? Should it fluctuate with special events, with different times of year? Should it be in line with a garage, even though a garage might offer protection from the weather and maybe give me some other benefit? Should it be in line with that, or should there be some kind of competitive advantage of being on the curb compared to being in a garage?
So and this is just my personal opinion based on my experience, but I think you have to look at, again, as you alluded to earlier, I think it's important to look at block by block and what's there and what's the draw. And I think the ultimate goal is, on-street space should be priced for a short-term turn, meaning you're looking at the businesses, how many restaurants are there, what does it take to maybe go in and shop and then you price that, and it should be higher priced, right? Because it's the most convenient. And so in some cases, it might be priced higher than a surface lot just because of the convenience factor.
So you're talking Chicago prices.
Yeah, I mean,
Chicago's crazy.
It depends on the block again and the draw to that block. But I've always said this: there's no brand loyalty in parking. You have three types of parkers. There's people that park for convenience, and so I'm one of the convenience people. So I don't want to drive around looking for a space, and I'll pretty much pay whatever it takes to be as close to where my destination is. Then you have people that are price conscious. So they're going to drive around and they're going to look for, which is okay. They're going to look for a space that's reasonable within their budget, and they're willing to walk the extra mile. And then you have people that are security, right? Mm-hmm. There's certain people that security is a factor. So they're looking around saying, I don't know if I want to park here. It looks shady. Or there's certain people that won't go in garages. They will not park in garages just because of the perception and the darkness or whatever. They just
Walking
don't
down
want to
those
be in
stairwells can be an adventure.
Yeah. So
Insight
that's
and
kind of
smell.
yeah, exactly. So I've always put it in again I put the Parker and the people into three major buckets, and that's the three buckets.
Yeah, my guest is John Conway, co-founder and chief business development officer at Parking Revenue Recovery Services. We're talking about his piece I saw on LinkedIn titled "Prime Real Estate Rock Bottom Price: The Politics of Parking." Lastly, you say out of your three, misused. How are spaces on the curb then misused?
I would say, for the most part, again, I think if, and I understand the politics completely, but if the politicians or the city realize the value of that space, I think the point I was trying to make is recognizing the value, especially when you're in a situation where the ebbs and flows of the economy. Cities go into their flow, whether they are in a budget crisis or whatever. They have to understand the value and find that fine line. If you have on-street space that's underpriced, what I was trying to say is it's being misused, probably. And then you have to look at the consistency of your enforcement program and kind of what the data that you're collecting out of those spaces, and what are the peak times. And so I think an underpriced on-street space is a misuse for sure.
Yeah. As I was thinking about how cities charge for their street parking, Denver, obviously, we're both very familiar with the
Yes.
city. In the urban core, and you'll see this in Chicago or St. Louis or Atlanta or in the big cities, they will have the parking meters, and then you have to pay a certain number, dollars per hour. But then just outside of there, in some more residential areas, you're not going to have any paid parking. It's all going to be free. And there has always been talk from the residents that they believe that they pay for infrastructure, the roads and such, and therefore the parking is theirs because their house is there and they're paying property tax, and that parking should be free, especially in those residential areas. But cities aren't necessarily not getting any revenue from those free areas because people do park illegally, or there are street sweeping days like here in Denver where they are fined, or so does the city in these free parking areas then maybe make a lot more revenue because they're relying on parking tickets to generate that revenue than they ever would with even charging in those free residential areas?
Well, first of all, I think it's an unsaid thing that all the parking revenue that's generated from the city, most cities will tell you that it's revenue neutral. So they're not making decisions based on how much revenue they can generate. And so I think most of the parking revenue goes into what's called a general fund. And then obviously the general fund supports other things like infrastructure and things like that. So most of the time when you're talking about, and again, back to what I was saying earlier about the curb, it's important to price the curb based, again, as we said, block by block. You may have high volume spaces, this is why the data is so important to collect. Those high volume spaces might be priced accordingly and much higher than kind of an on-street space that's like 3 or 4 blocks away, right? So you're giving people, as we went back to you're giving all kinds of people, the people that are convenience. The guy like me, I'll pay $4 an hour or $5 an hour at that meter so I can just walk right in. But 2 blocks away, there's meters that are lower priced because of the turnover on those spaces, right? So you're giving people the opportunity to find that lower meter cost. With respect to residential, most cities have a RPP program, where, in certain blocks and neighborhoods, those people are restricted. You have to apply for an RPP. In some cases, they charge for RPPs. But I think a residential street without some kind of parking plan or some kind of, parking policy is chaos in itself. And this is what happens when you start putting together parking programs. This is what happened in Manitou Springs. So when they were focused on the block, the top tier spaces, the on street. So once they started converting those to paid, it pushed people into the neighborhoods, which caused chaos. People were parking in front of driveways. So then they had to put together a residential permit program, and so it just keeps pushing people back and back. So ultimately, when you're looking at your parking program, you have to address the entire ecosystem, which could be 10 or 15 blocks away, because when you're making pricing changes or you're making policy changes, it ultimately affects, and it keeps pushing back and further back, causing problems.
But that's
the neighborhoods.
That's a unique situation, though, in Manitou Springs, similarly to what has happened in Estes Park, another mountain town, tourist town, where they have a lot of fudge and taffy, and you can get up there, but they have so many visitors there, and they don't have street parking available. So at their visitor center, they have a very large lot, and they will shuttle people to and from the downtown area for free, because that allows people to then come to the town, park for free, take the free shuttle, because it's worth it for the town to have the visitors spend more money than they would on parking in those stores.
Absolutely. So, Matt, Estes Park is a good example of a place that has looked at the entire ecosystem. And from what I see, I mean, we've been involved way back with Estes Park, but they've really put a lot of thought into it. They built off-street garage, and I think that's what you're referring to, the shuttles. And then they've put signage as you come into the town, kind of wayfinding signage for parking. So they've, Estes Park, I know people up there that are involved in the parking program. They have put a lot of thought over the years, and they have a great master plan for parking. So I would say, that's one of the areas where, they've really done it right. So
yeah, there's no argument that large cities, like urban cities, whatever city you want to talk about, likes to reduce, and Denver's been classic at this, and even though they not often have come out and said, city council people have said, yeah, we would rather see no cars in our downtown core, but that's what they're working towards. They would love to get rid of private vehicle traffic. And we've seen New York City try congestion pricing, and other cities around the world have tried congestion pricing and eliminate lanes, make one-way streets into two-way streets. And then the next key here is to eliminate parking altogether, street parking, and limit how many other spaces are available except in the residential tower just for those residents. So it was really, if there's no place to park your car, if you're a private driver, then there's no point in actually driving in these downtown areas, right? So you would almost have to develop these outside lots where people could then park and then be scootered or ride shared or mass transited into the urban core.
I think you bring up a good point. Definitely the smart city concept, when it came out several years ago, parking garages were going to turn into multimodal, drop-off points and, driverless cars. And so everybody got into a frenzy and kind of stirred up the marketplace that this is happening. And the reality is it didn't happen, and it's not going to happen anytime soon, right? So I believe it is going to happen, and we will evolve there. But that's why I think we have to be careful about, eliminating and making it harder for people to come to a downtown, like creating bike lanes that nobody uses. I love bike lanes. I go to Europe a lot. When I'm in Germany or Hungary, I mean, those bike lanes are used and they're packed, and most people, but Denver, is just not there yet, right? So, is it a place that we want to get to? Probably, yeah. So, but forcing people, I mean, I look at the light rail. I don't see a lot of people using the light rail. And so you have to look at the demographic and who you're trying to and solve the immediate problem. The immediate problem is the fact of the matter is you want people to come downtown, right? We want people back downtown. And so we have to make it as easy and hassle-free for them as possible. And eliminating lanes and creating, getting rid of parking lots is not a short-term plan to help a tax base, a revenue trying to get people downtown. So I don't think people from Highlands Ranch are biking to Denver to go out to dinner, and it's not going to happen anytime soon, right? But eventually we will get there. But I think people need to pause and think about, wow, do we really want to do this, or is this going to be a 10 or 15 year plan? And this gets to my point. If I go back to Higginlooper when he was mayor, Mayor Webb, and even Hancock, they had parking commissions and they solicited private business and people that had parking expertise, like myself. Yeah. And other people, and created a group that worked with city council to try to come to, to try to make plans and make policies and getting input from the business side of it, and people that live and breathe parking in the private sector. And so I think those were all beneficial over the years and to help guide policy. And so I don't see that happening now. Not that it could be happening now, but I think there should be more collaboration with the business community, and specifically when you're making transportation and parking policies, let's get the people that live that every day across the country and have the different experiences.
Yeah, my guest is John Conway, co-founder and Chief Business Development Officer at Parking Revenue Recovery Services. He's been a long-time parking expert. He's also been a former City of Denver Parking Commissioner and also host of his own podcast called All Things Parking with Danny and John. And you were just talking, I think you briefly mentioned it, about this political issue here, because you say that parking rates are often set politically. What is the political advantage, either on the left or the right, to gain here? And Denver has been traditionally controlled by Democrats. And is there if it was controlled the other way, if it was controlled by Republicans, would there be any difference in the parking philosophy of the left and the right?
I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think if you go back, if you go back to Higginlooper and look at the way he was elected as mayor, if you remember some of his commercials, and at the time there was a gentleman that took over from longtime parking director Roberta Gillis, and she retired after a long career. And there was really somebody from the private sector that came in as a director and had all the right ideas, but didn't understand the politics of city. So meters were being added. There were increases. I remember going to many. The South Broadway neighborhood was up in arms. So I think that was, and that's really, Higginlooper was elected plugging the meters because parking was such a controversy. So I think the city of Denver has kind of been afraid since that moment because there was so much turmoil created. But the idea was right. So it's, how do you execute the idea, right? So most of those businesses on South Broadway and most of the community members, I think there wasn't enough outreach, right? So you don't just go into a neighborhood, raise the meter rates 50 cents. You might do that in the private sector, and it's, oh well, and it probably was the right thing to do. But I think the city and the leadership at the time didn't handle it correctly. I think if you go in with a plan and a message and you involve the community and those neighborhoods, it may take, instead you want to roll this increase out in 6 months, but the reality is you probably have to spend a year communicating with the businesses, understanding the business and the residents, their concerns with what you're trying to do, and be collaborative and come up with a plan that everybody feels like they were a part of. Yeah. And so I think if there's a politician listening to your podcast, I think number one, my point would be, look, your curb space is too cheap, right? And especially now, while you're in a budget crisis, there's definitely a revenue opportunity there, which I know people don't want to talk about. But it's what's best for the business, right? And so the businesses may not understand it. There are some that do get it because they're frustrated. There may be a business that is a destination business that people will park 20 blocks away. They don't care. But there's another struggling business that says, I'm struggling because of parking. Well, usually it's not the case. Your business model, you're probably struggling because of that. But you have to listen to everybody and their concerns. So my recommendation would be to put together a commission and help, if you do have a plan to increase, involve the neighborhoods and have a long-term plan and involve them and come up with a collaborative plan. Then everybody feels like they're a part of it. And it takes more work doing it that way, but you're more successful in the long run.
Yeah. Well, South Broadway also has its own issues with how they created the new bike lane down there and changed the way the parking is structured there with these also odd left turns with its own bike traffic signal. So there are other issues there specifically along South Broadway. But you also say in your piece that undervalued and underpriced street parking could harm the very business it's intended to support. But there are people that do look at price, like me, and might not. If I'm paying $8 for parking, that's $8 less that I have to spend in that business that I was trying to get to.
And that's a great point, and that goes back to the 3 buckets that I put consumers in. And I think that's why putting together a comprehensive plan. So you're willing to, the question is, you don't want to pay $8, but you'll pay $3. And the question is, are you willing to walk 3 blocks instead of walking right into the door? And the answer is probably, yeah, you're willing to walk 3 blocks.
Or I might just go find it online. I might go to another store that's closer to me.
Maybe. I think, if you're talking about South Broadway, there's a lot of restaurants. I think South Broadway is great. And there's a lot of great places, but I don't go there a lot because I can't park anywhere. It's very frustrating for me to find parking on South Broadway. And so that's just me. But I think
if the Goodwill would let you, there's plenty of spaces in the back of the Goodwill there, their parking lot.
Well, that's the other thing. Jason, if you look at what Cherry Creek was faced with, and I was a part of this on the commission, there were so many businesses that closed down, but yet they had predatory booting. So people were hiding in bushes. And I kept saying to these businesses, open up your parking lots when your business closed. Let people come in, charge a fee for people, and open them up so people can use and utilize that space. Yeah. Because ultimately, it's best for the community, right?
Right. So, Could you see a time, and we briefly talked about this a minute ago, but could you see a time in the future where cities are really void of traffic, only allowing scooters and bikes and rideshare vehicles in them because most, if not all, the parking has been either eliminated or set at a price where it does turn people off, and they go, I'm just not willing to head downtown because I don't live there. I live in the suburbs, and it's just not worth it for me.
Yeah. So that gets back to my earlier point. I mean, I'm a Gen X person, and I think, and so I like kicking my tires. I like washing my car. I have no desire to get rid of my vehicle. And so there's still a lot of people like me out there. And so you have to look at it. I feel like the city of Denver right now, there is a push to get rid of parking. And I think that would be a disaster because I think I think they should facilitate more parking. just because I think there's a lot of people like myself who live in the suburbs. And I used to enjoy coming downtown, and my wife loves coming downtown. There's a lot of restaurants. There's a lot of good things. We enjoyed the 16th Street Mall. And so, but if I can't get downtown with my own vehicle, so I can come and go and have the convenience of having my own car, then I probably won't go downtown, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I'll ride my bike to downtown Littleton, right?
Right. Because in the suburbs, the stores in the neighborhoods are really spread out. So you do need a car and you need the parking. That's why you have these malls and these big box stores in the shopping areas with all this space that sits open. And I've talked to other parking people where they get frustrated with these, Walmarts and Sam's Clubs and Targets and that sort of thing, where they have all this space, but at overnight, then you have all this, it's just sitting there unused. It's used during some height, on the day after Thanksgiving. But a lot of the time, it's just unused space that could be used in other ways.
I kind of agree with that as well. I think the vision should be, to get back to the statement that you made, do you see eventually cars not going downtown and ride shares and different things? I do see that as we evolve. I think the younger generation, I have nephews that, didn't get their driver's license till they were 25. Well, that as well as I do, I was chomping at the bit at 15 and a half. I think we could get our permit.
I was 14, started to drive.
Yeah. And so, but that's not the case. So I think over time, it probably will evolve and get there. It's just, when do we start implementing? And I think forcing some of these visions too early, especially a city like Denver that's spread out, and has the downtown relies on people from outside the suburb, people coming downtown. So I think if you lose sight of, reality and you start looking at it, how quickly do these policies, do we put an infrastructure that eventually will allow us to get to that place? I think that's a smarter look at the future. Do I think we'll eventually get there? Probably. The question is when, right?
Right. My guest is John Conway, co-founder and chief business development officer at Parking Revenue Recovery Services, talking about his piece I saw on LinkedIn titled Prime Real Estate, Rock Bottom Price, The Politics of Parking. You can find him at prrsparking.com. The feedback comments on your LinkedIn post were all pretty positive. Those are people that follow you, though, and know you and know parking, so that's to be expected. Basically saying you were right on the money with your commentary, but I imagine you've also talked to cities about your view on all of this, on curb parking and other parking. What has been that feedback you've received from the folks that don't follow you from these cities?
Yeah, so I think initially, I think the article, if people were looking at it from a city, it would probably not go over so well. But if you look at the history, I've been involved with a lot of implementations and looked at a lot of parking across the country for multiple municipalities. And so ultimately, I think I understand their challenge. They definitely have a challenge. You have a constituency of people that are coming downtown that are, like you, they're price conscious. So they have to cater to multiple different interests. They have a business that's struggling and blames it on the parking. And then you have a business that's thriving that's also blaming it on the parking, but blaming it because, like Manitou Springs, the coffee shop and Maggie's Farm, which was I think the THC or marijuana store, was complaining because there wasn't, they wanted the paid parking program because they felt like without the paid parking program, there was no space for their people to come in and go. And so those two businesses were thriving, yet there was a bead store woman that was selling beads that was, complaining that, and her fear was, the paid parking program would kill her business. And, how does a politician look at that person and say, no, the paid parking program isn't killing your business?
But when you look at those two different businesses, the pot store, people are in and out pretty fast. In the bead store, you're looking at things. You're going to be there for 15 or 20 or 30 minutes.
Yeah, I think what kills the bead business is the big box stores,
Online, yeah.
online, Amazon, right? That was, and ultimately that's what's killing that business. But from a politician standpoint, you can't say that, right? And so ultimately, you have to try to cater. But at the end of the day, you have to make a policy that works for business. And again, a no paid parking program creates chaos, and it's bad for all business.
And obviously,
right?
there's big money in parking because I was reading a story, I think it was in Business Den, about, where was it? Well, anyway, it was how the Denver Art Museum just paid $7 million for a parking lot right next to the museum, saying they bought the property as a long-term investment, and they're going to continue to operate it as a parking lot and use that money in their business model. Because it really does prove that there's big money to be had in parking spaces.
So one thing I pointed out in the article, if I go out to Denver International today, and I travel a lot, so I'm there a lot. If I lose my ticket for 24 hours, I pay $168.
That must be in that super concierge lot, right?
It's the parking garage,
Okay.
right? That are close. So if you remember, I told you, Jason,
Yeah.
I park for convenience, so I want to park directly in front. Now, there's all kinds of alternatives at the airport. You can do off-airport parking. But the point of it is, if you look at the price for airports around the country, which are usually owned and operated by the same municipality, the price difference is crazy. And politically, it's a different animal. Nobody looks at $31 a day and even blinks an eye. Right?
Well, that's why you have the private lots there and in other cities where they charge a lot less.
Right.
Or the hotels now, you can actually go to a hotel and pay them even a lower fee, and even though you're not staying at the hotel, or you do have a park and stay a program at these hotels.
Yeah, so that's another challenge that the hotels face out there. People might go and stay one night and then travel for 8 days.
Yeah.
And they take up the parking at the hotel, and so
but they pay for it. Typically, they pay for it.
But there's people that don't, so they won't identify that they're staying there 8 days. So that we've been called upon and have been out there at some of those hotels because of that. And so again, there's always a chain reaction in parking, right? Right. So you solve one problem and then you've created another somewhere else.
Yeah, sure. And I know we were getting up on the end of our time. Is there a most? And I'll ask you this as our final thing. Is there a most efficient way to fit cars in spaces? I've always been a fan of only like one space, pull in, and then you pull out the same way. So you're always going forward. You can always see in and out. You're not backing up into somebody. But I also saw a picture of, I don't know, it was maybe a parking lot in Japan where they were parked almost like a zipper, where the one car was here and another car was like right here against almost the passenger or the driver's side door, and it was a perfect way to utilize that space because it was only, instead of enough room for two cars to go into that parking lane, it was only room for one. But the way they it was fascinating.
I think I travel Europe a lot. I think if you look at the size difference of vehicles, between the United States and
you're
Europe,
not getting an F-150 in that parking lot in Japan.
That's right. It becomes a little bit challenging, but at some of the ways they park cars in some of those cities in Europe, but the cars are smaller, so they can probably be more creative. I think Denver has an ordinance on the size of the space that you have to have. I think there's some lots that have smaller spaces, but they were grandfathered in years ago. But typically a space has to be a certain size in most cities.
But in general, do you think there's a most efficient way, whether it's, where you have to, where there's a lane that you go and everybody pulls in to the right or the left, and then they have to reverse out through that one lane, so it's a one-way lane, or two-way lanes where the spaces are perpendicular to the where you're traveling in that parking lot?
I definitely think a parking layout is best when you're not having to reverse and turn around, and it's a smooth ingress and egress. But I think it's challenging. Every piece of property is different. And I think what goes into a parking layout most of the time is revenue, right? So how am I going to lay this lot out to generate the most revenue and get the most amount of spaces?
Yeah.
And so sometimes that outweighs when you're setting up a parking lot, you might not set it up in the most convenient way because you're trying to maximize the revenue.
But a mall like, Park Meadows Mall Park Meadows Retail Resort, as they like to say.
Yeah.
They're not generating revenue. I mean, they just want you to park there and come in the mall.
That's right. And so in that instance, like a Park Meadows, they should be designing that parking lot to be as easy and convenient and smooth as possible because they don't want people to remember the parking lot. And honestly, nobody wants to remember parking, right? The best
Right.
parking experience is the one never remembered,
Yeah.
right? Because it's not a destination. That's why I argue with some people in my industry because there's people that believe there's brand loyalty in parking. And I would say the closest you could get to brand loyalty is the business person or the person that frequently travels and has a great experience at an off airport. They get their newspaper, they might have dry cleaning, something like that. I think that's the closest we get
Or
to
a
brand
stadium
loyalty.
like Coors Field, or Broncos, that sort of thing, if they're always parking in the same places.
Right. But I don't think people go downtown. I'm going down to dinner tonight and go, oh, I'm going to park with this parking company because I love this parking company. Right. I'm going to park wherever it's, either cheapest, secure, and convenient.
Yeah.
And that's what drives the consumer.
And John Conway is the co-founder and chief business development officer at Parking Revenue Recovery Services. You can find them at prrsparking.com. You can also listen to his very own podcast called All Things Parking with Danny and John. Is that all you do? Is talk about this kind of stuff every episode?
Not really. If you
Okay.
go to our podcast, I try to talk about. Last year we kind of focused on entrepreneurship and self-doubt. I like tying stories into taking people from other industries and showing them that most people, whether it's whether you're a journalist or you're in the parking industry or you're in sports, most of us face the same challenges. And one of the common themes that came out of last year was self-doubt, right? And how much people battle that. I had a famous Bronco wide receiver on, Mark Jackson,
Yep.
and told his story, which I don't think he really ever told, but on our podcast. But, you go from that famous drive with John Elway in Cleveland, and then you report to training camp the next year after going to the Super Bowl. Now, of course, they lost, but quite an accomplishment, right? And then you're sneaking out in the middle of the night, packing your car because you're going to quit because you're having self-doubt, right? And it was a fascinating story because there's a fan that happened to be camped out at training camp and said, "Hey, where are you going?" And he spent 3 days packing his car so nobody would notice. And the fan talked him off the ledge, and he went back and went on to 2 more Super Bowls. And so I just find we're all faced with those moments of self-doubt. So I like highlighting those stories to try to show people that you keep getting up and you keep getting up every day and you keep fighting the fight. And if you fail, you get back up and try it again.
Yeah,
right?
I think, but at our ages, John, I think you get to the point when you do get to a certain age, you're like, whatever. I mean, at this point, whatever.
But for the most part, though, we do have a lot of parking professionals on.
Good.
And we enjoy talking about parking. There's funny stories. So I would encourage some of your listeners to check it out.
Yeah.
It's quite entertaining. So.
Excellent. Yeah, and you can find them. I'll have a link for their show, the DannyJohnShow.com, in the description of this fine episode right here. Hey, thank you so much, John, for your expertise, and best of luck with with your piece and with your show.
Yeah, I think I would end with, again, what we're trying to do with the technology is connect the vehicles to the parking lots, right? And making it as easy and smooth as possible for people. And I think that I know you've had Spot Hero and some of the others on. When you start connecting the ecosystems and the different technologies in parking, it will allow people a less friction experience. And again, our goal is to, not have to issue anybody a notice and make it as easy as possible for compliance.
Yeah.
So,
there you go.
Yeah.
All right. Well, John, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Take care, Jason.
And again, the link to get all of John's information is right there in the description of this show, as well as the link to his podcast, if you ever want to check that out as well. It's an interesting conversation about parking, and I've had other interesting conversations about parking, as John was referencing during our conversation. I think that's the next war on people going into cities. If you've ever tried to park in Chicago, there are spaces on the street that will cost you dozens and dozens, like $20, $30, $40. And it is, I think, ridiculous. And it makes you go, and of course there was nobody parked there. I went to go park in that area, and I'm like, there's no way people are parking this, and there aren't, because there was a garage right next to it that was cheaper. So I went there instead of paying for the street parking. But if the garage was full and maybe somebody had to do business, I don't know. But like John said, there are people that will pay for that convenience, and there are people like me who won't. And I think that's what makes the world go round. Yay! Okay, anyway, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, let me know. And anyway, thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. And until next time, I'm Jason Liber, the traffic guy. Be safe, and as always, happy motoring.